We don't have that much time today, and I want to make sure that everyone has time for their questions. So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this session, From Myth to Meal to Mystery, the Metamorphosis of Language and Symbols. I could not say that again if I tried. My name is Sheila Dougherty, and I'm a Research Services Librarian at Gilman Library. So just a few notes about how we're going to conduct this session. We're going to hear from the presenters one after the other, and then after they give all of their presentations, we're going to open up the floor for questions. So, without further ado, I would like to present our first presenter, Riley Martin. Riley Martin is a first-year psychological and brain sciences major with a minor in political science from New Gretna, New Jersey. I am also from New Jersey. She enjoys studying mental health and social justice, and she is passionate about classical mythology and how it continues to shape modern literature and media. And her professor is Professor Pollack. I'll see the stage to you.
Hello everyone. As you just heard, my name is Riley Martin, and last semester I was a student in Professor Pollack's Art in the Age of Shakespeare class. My project was titled Small Latin and Less Greek, and it focuses on why Shakespeare keeps returning to Ovid's Metamorphoses throughout his plays. And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, from thence to honor thee I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us. Vesuvius, Axius, him of Cordova dead, to life again to hear thy buskin tread. And shake a stage, or when thy socks were on, leave thee alone for the comparison. This quote originates from Jonson's poem To My Beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, which appears in the first folio. Ben Jonson and Shakespeare were rivals on the Elizabethan stage, but they also had a friendly relationship. The line I was most focused on in this is when he says that Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek. This is often read as an insult about his contemporary education, saying that he didn't know Latin or Greek. However, it was most likely meant as a compliment. In this context, the phrase thou hadst works conditionally. It's almost as if you're saying, even if you had no Latin and Greek, you still would surpass the ancient writers. We see Jonson using this in a lot of his works, most particularly Sejanus' His Fall, and it is really just him praising him. Shakespeare likely attended the King's New School in Stratford, where students study classical texts. One of these texts would have been Ovid's Metamorphoses, in both the Latin translation and the more popular English translation by Arthur Golding. We know Golding's version influenced him because some lines in Titus Andronicus reflect Golding almost word for word. This could be seen as Titus describes the horrific fate of Timora's sons, as he says, Saturnius, go fetch them hither to us presently. Titus, why there they are, both baked in this pie, whereof their mother daintily hath fed, eating the flesh that she herself hath bred. This passage echoes Golding's translation almost directly as it says, King Tyreus sitting in the throne of his forefathers fed, and swallowed down the self-same flesh that of his bowels bred. We see similar word choices in fed, flesh, and bread in this. So a big reason that Shakespeare relied on Ovid was to show Renaissance humanism. Metamorphosis reflects on these principles of individual experience, moral choice, transformation, and human motivation. Metamorphosis is, in essence, a book about transformation, whether it be physical, emotional, or psychological. Its stories gave Shakespeare real examples of people caught between desire, fate, and the consequences of their actions. Ovid gave him the language for talking about what makes people human, and Shakespeare translated that to the stage. So the story that we see Shakespeare use most often from Ovid is the myth of Pyramus and Thisbe. It talks about two lovers who are kept apart by their families, leading them to have secret meetings. A series of misunderstandings leads to their tragic deaths. This clearly becomes the basis of Romeo and Juliet, as we could see. But Shakespeare reshapes this myth to fit into his world. Forbidden love wasn't just a story to individuals in Elizabethan England. It was something his audience knew firsthand. Figures like Sir Walter Raleigh had been punished for secret marriages. His unapproved marriage to one of Queen Elizabeth's ladies led to his brief imprisonment in the Tower of London and fall from favor. So Shakespeare uses Ovid to create a situation his audience would understand, where love collides with family, politics, and fate. But he doesn't just stop at tragedy. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, we see him rewrite the same myth as comedy. The story becomes a ridiculous play within a play performed by a group of amateur actors. It's over the top and self-aware, but the central theme, which shows love being blocked by outside forces, also appears in the main plot with Hermia and Lysander's relationship. Scholars like Jonathan Bate call this a translatio, which is a Renaissance term for carrying an old text into a new cultural movement. Shakespeare translates Ovid for the stage, shifting between tragedy and comedy depending on what he wants the audience to see. So we also see Shakespeare use Metamorphosis to explore the human psyche. Hamlet's a perfect example of this. In the to be or not to be soliloquy, we see Hamlet struggle with action and inaction. He wrestles with his own mind as he says, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them." This struggle for inaction mirrors Ovid's story of Narcissus. It's someone trapped between desire and paralysis, and unable to choose or act. Both Hamlet and Narcissus show how desire, hesitation, and self-reflection can paralyze someone and lead to tragic consequences. Shakespeare was clearly familiar with the story of Narcissus. We see him make a direct reference to it in The Two Noble Kinsmen, where Emilia has a conversation with her maid as she says, this garden has a world of pleasures in it. What flower is this?" "'Tis called Narcissus, madam. That was a fair boy certain, but a fool to love himself. Were there not maids enough?" In Macbeth, we see Shakespeare turn to Ovidian ideas about desire and ambition. Macbeth's hallucination of the dagger, something he reaches for but can't quite grasp, resembles the story of Icarus, whose desires drive him beyond his limits. In a sense, he flew too close to the sun in his attempts to seize the crown. Ovid's myths often warn about what happens when ambition outruns reason. We see Shakespeare use that same logic to show Macbeth's psychological unraveling. Shakespeare also demonstrates clear knowledge of the myth of Icarus in King Henry VI, Part 3, when King Henry draws a direct comparison to it during his conversation with Richard. "I, Daedalus, my poor boy Icarus, thy father Minos that denied our course, the sun that seared the wings of my sweet boy, thy brother Edward, and thyself the sea." Not all Shakespearean ideas are tragic, nor are all Ovidian ideas. In The Tempest, Shakespeare focuses on transformation in a more hopeful way. We see Prospero's personal transformation as it becomes the clearest example of Shakespeare's engagement with Ovid's understanding of humanity. He begins the play driven by anger and revenge. He's motivated by the desire to seek vengeance against his brother Antonio and King Alonso, who betrayed him and stole the dukedom of Milan. But as the story unfolds, we begin to see that magic can't truly correct the past. In the end, he chooses mercy, as he says, "The rare actions is in virtue than in vengeance." This mirrors a lot of the moral transformations that we see in Metamorphosis. The play becomes Shakespeare's most humanistic engagement with Ovid, as he shows that people can change, not just their circumstances. This mirrors the internal metamorphosis we find throughout Ovid's works, where characters are often tasked with confronting their own conflicts before achieving their goals. Sometimes we see as Shakespeare doesn't just reference Ovid, but he puts the actual book on stage. In Titus Andronicus, after Lavinia is assaulted, she brings out Metamorphosis and opens to the story of Philomela, who is raped and then silenced. The book is mentioned by name as Shakespeare writes, "Titus, Lucius, what book is that she tosseth so? Young Lucius, grandsire to his Ovid's Metamorphosis, my mother gave it me." In Ovid's myth, Philomela is raped and then silenced as her attacker cuts out her tongue to hide the crime. But ultimately, she is able to communicate the truth by weaving a tapestry that reveals what happened to her. Lavinia suffers a similar fate at the hands of Timora's sons, who rape her and mutilate her, cutting out her tongue and her hands to prevent her from revealing the crime. This is one of the strongest direct Ovidian allusions that we see in Shakespeare's works. It lets the audience understand her suffering through a story they most likely already knew. Ovid becomes a tool for communication when Lavinia herself couldn't speak. So why did Shakespeare keep returning to Ovid? Based on my research, I think that he kept coming back because it gave him a framework for understanding people as a whole. Through Ovid, Shakespeare could show us love as something tragic like he did in Romeo and Juliet. It is something ridiculous as in Midsummer Night's Dream, hesitation and inner conflict in Hamlet, ambition and downfall in Macbeth, and forgiveness and transformation in The Tempest. Ovid's myths let Shakespeare express human complexity in a way his audience understood instinctively. Classical myths were very well known by educated people in Elizabethan England, and Shakespeare adapted them so they could be portrayed on the Renaissance stage. This is what makes Ovid so essential to his work. As Hamlet famously says, "What a piece of work is a man." This is a sentiment that reflects the same fascination with human complexity that drew Shakespeare back to Ovid's myths again and again. So, my research for this project relied primarily on materials from the Folger Shakespeare Library. It holds one of the world's most important collections of Shakespearean and early modern texts. I worked with both physical artifacts and digital resources, including early printed editions of Ovid's Metamorphosis. In addition to these primary sources, I consulted secondary scholarship through the Gelman Library, where I accessed interpretations by modern scholars. My research process was documented on the Folger Shakespeare Library's collation blog. You can see it at that link. It's where I discuss my research and how it shaped my understanding of Shakespeare's engagement with classical mythology. Thank you so much for listening. I would especially like to thank my professor for her guidance and support throughout the project, and the librarians at the Fuller Shakespeare Library and Gelman Library. Their kindness and valuable help really helped me in accessing the resources that made this work possible. And then I have so many sources, so I'm going to fly through those for you.
Oh, wow.
That's all my sources. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to welcome to the stage Justin Tomley Anovic, a freshman from Falls Church, Virginia, majoring in psycholinguistics and minoring in STEM teaching. His professor is Professor Quave. And their presentation is entitled The Disputatious History of Dumplings. Where do they come from and why does it matter? Okay, everyone, welcome Justin to the stage.
Make sure.
So it should be open for you. Yeah, if you just click view.
There we go. All right. Hi, my name is Justin Tomlyanovich. My presentation is The Disputatious History of Dumplings. So for my class, I took the UW Dining on the Past. So we focused on understanding and reconstructing past foodways through the sort of lens of archaeology. So we were looking at a lot of archaeological sources and seeing how can we understand what people were eating in the past through that. And so I had two kind of big rules to follow while I was working on this assignment that I think are more specific to my UW course that I think are important to understand. One was that I had to include some sort of archaeological source and tie that into my writing, and that I had to focus on food or foodways in some sort of kind of broad sense. But then I think there's also sort of a third unspoken rule to writing a UW paper, which is creating something you're proud of and creating something you feel really demonstrates your skills as a writer and demonstrates the things you are able to learn. And one way to do this, something that'll help you a lot with this, is writing about something that you're interested in. And so for me, I'm very interested in dumplings. I grew up Polish American, so I ate a lot of pierogi growing up as a kid. And one thing that really interested me was the fact that pierogi, which comes from Poland, is very, very similar both visually and in the ingredients to foods like dim sum and gyoza, which is really interesting because when you look at a map, these countries are very separate from each other, and yet there's this similarity between their culture. And so this was something I wanted to research. And I went in with the intention of hoping to be able to explain, here are where dumplings are from, and here's how they got to all these parts of the world. But unfortunately, it began to be a bit tricky. I had an archaeological source, I had these sources that discussed dumplings, but I didn't have a source that gave that direct answer, where are dumplings from? And I was really, really conflicted about this, and I was thinking there must be something I'm doing wrong. And so in times of conflict, I did what I normally like to do, and I called my mom. And my mom is a librarian. She's been a librarian since longer than I've been alive, and I thought if someone's going to be able to help me find the right source, it would be her. And so we sit on the phone and we talk for about half an hour about all these different things, all these different ideas I had, and why I'm feeling conflicted about my sources, and you know, the fact that I'm frustrated that I don't have this good final answer. And eventually she explains to me, you know, yeah, you don't have that final answer, but you've been sitting here telling me all about these sources. Is that not enough for a paper? And it made me realize that I really do have a lot to say, even if I can't answer that one question I was hoping to answer. And so I shifted my thesis, which I think is a fine thing to do when you're just starting with the research on your paper. And I decided to focus on, you know, what do we know about dumplings? How do we know that? And why are we missing crucial parts of really being able to know it? And so one thing I started off my paper with was just defining a dumpling. Now, I wish I could do this with all you guys, but for the sake of time, we're just going to quickly skim through something that I think is really important, which is understanding what a dumpling is, right? Because you can start with something like gyoza, which I feel like we can all sort of generally agree is an example of a dumpling. And by using that as our model, we can argue that a bao bun should count as a dumpling too, right? It's a slightly different type of dough, but it's very similar in the way that it's a sort of dough and filling that's boiled. And if we're allowing bao buns, how about the apple dumpling, right? Which has dumpling in the name. I feel like that's a valid dumpling, right? And so if we're talking about apples being wrapped up in dough, why not an apple turnover as a dumpling? Could we not argue that? And if we try to argue that, what about baklava as a dumpling, right? Because that's also some sort of paste wrapped up in dough. And sure, it's prepared a little different, but the gyoza and the bao bun, if we're both counting those, that's also prepared a little differently. And then what about a crepe cake, right? Because that's also layers of dough and filling. And obviously at a certain point you have to stand back and say, this is ridiculous, right? I want an essay about dumplings. And if I come here giving you a history of the crepe cake, you're going to be a little frustrated. And so it's very important to outline exactly what are we talking about as we research it and as we discuss it. And so I start my essay by comparing a few different definitions. One comes from an author, Barbara Galani. She is very, very involved in the world of dumplings. She's cited a lot because she wrote just a whole book dedicated to dumplings. And I found her definition very interesting because it came from a lot of experience, that she was very, very clear in how she defined dumplings. But I found myself disagreeing with her in certain points and especially trying to poke holes in it of, okay, well, if we're counting that as a dumpling, what about this? And so just acknowledging where I agreed with her, where I didn't agree with her, helped me form that definition. I also talk about Nick Kindlesberger. He's an author for the Chicago Tribune. He talks about food a lot, and he had a very interesting sort of stance on the dumplings where he talked about defining them not by what they're made up of, but how they're made. And so he talks about the Lunar New Year festivals, how dumplings are normally made in groups, people come together to make them. And so he says, maybe that's what a dumpling is, this thing that you kind of come together in a group with, which I think is pretty broad, but it did make me interested in the fact that part of my definition of what I was considering a dumpling was a food that's practical, right? Because when you look at a dumpling, it's this food wrapped up in dough, you can travel with it, you can easily make it, it allows you to utilize a limited amount of meat while still creating a full meal. And so I thought about his definition and that sort of understanding of dumplings, not just as what they're made up of, but why you're creating them. And then I also talked about Wikipedia briefly. They have a very, very broad definition of what a dumpling is. And that gives very interesting sort of introspective into if you're trying to include every definition of a dumpling, you end up getting really lost in the weeds. So that helped me also kind of draw some lines on what are we going to be counting as a dumpling and what are we not going to be counting as a dumpling, continuing my research and going into my paper. And so starting my paper, I first begin to explore the idea of dumplings coming from China. This is, if you Google it, that's what Google is going to tell you, right? You don't even have to do any scrolling. It's on the AI generated sort of summary. It's very simple. But as you kind of go into researching it, it becomes a little bit more complicated than that. There are ways to sort of build up this narrative that dumplings are from China, and I talk about it in my paper, especially with this archaeological source where you find these dumplings that are over 2,000 years old that are found in China, right? Which allows you to sort of build up this argument of well, they've definitely been in China for a long time. But when you begin to look at the story of where do dumplings come from, and you look at it from the lens of China, the story is weird. There's a lot of holes in it, and it kind of comes off as a legend, and it makes you wonder, well, clearly this can't just be the answer, right? And so I explored a little further, and through my research, I found that a lot of academics like to credit Central Asia as the origin of the dumpling. And this is also a very interesting and compelling sort of story to take and to move on with, because Central Asians are normally have nomadic tribes. So there's the Turkic nomads, who are frequently cited with the creation of the dumpling. And this makes a lot of sense because, first of all, these are people who would really benefit from a small, convenient sort of pouch of dough. And also these are people who had traveled all across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and have been to all these places where we see examples of dumplings. Finally, I mention, and this is just something I was sort of interested in and really wanted to include in my paper, I discussed the simultaneous invention. This is the idea that two people could come up with the same thing having never contacted each other before. This happened with the invention of calculus. This happened with the invention of the steam engine. And so I discussed this paper by author Lemley. And I think it's interesting the way he discusses the fact that if we all have the same problems and the similar way to solve those problems, we end up coming up with similar solutions. And you find that that's most likely what ended up happening with dumplings. That we all sort of had these ingredients and we all needed a convenient pouch for food, and so we all ended up coming up with a sort of similar solution separately in all these different cultures. Lastly, I sort of wrap up my essay just reflecting on a lot of these things, talking about what interested me the most about it, and what I wanted my reader to take away from those things. And I found it especially interesting to understand why we're still missing parts of this story. Obviously, with food, something to be eaten, so it's not really something you can preserve and look back on. And it's also just interesting to think about generally how our understanding of culture is really difficult to discuss. That it's difficult to argue the idea of maybe this food that's really important to my culture didn't come from my culture. And so I reflect on a lot of that stuff. And one last thing I'd like to give you guys before I go as a piece of advice is I would highly recommend getting someone to look over your paper. So for me, it was required that I get peer review, but I would argue that even if you're not required to do peer review, having a friend or a peer in one of your classes read over your essay is really, really helpful. It really helped me understand, what do people want to hear? What do people already understand and don't need me explaining? And what do people not understand that I thought was kind of clear or obvious? So that's sort of my final recommendation is I would really say, get people to read over your essay, get people to tell you their thoughts. That's going to be very, very helpful with your writing process. And that's all, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin. Next up, we have Sammy Park. Sam is a freshman majoring in international affairs with an interest in economic security policy. He is from Wethersfield, Connecticut.
I think you got the wrong person. I'm not from Connecticut.
You're not from Connecticut?
No,
I'm sorry,
okay.
I think somebody sent me the wrong bio. What's your presentation?
It's this one.
Okay, this is really long journey.
Yes.
Okay, I have the presentation right. Sorry, I have your name
It's just a
wrong.
bio. Okay.
Okay, sorry, my apologies for that. I've got some bad information. So we'll be is your name Sam?
It's Sammy.
Okay.
Not Sam.
We're welcoming now Sammy to give their presentation, The Fool's Really Long Journey, a look into the development of tarot cards. Sam, take it away.
Oh my god. Okay, hi, what's up? Hi, what's up? My name is Sammy, not from Connecticut, from New York. And for my UW class, I was in the Reading Without Words one, and this is a very image analysis heavy class. It's not really all about long readings. We more spend our time in class discussing images, the context, the purpose, all that stuff. And I really enjoyed this because I don't like long readings. I don't read them at all for lectures. And so this class is very enjoyable, 10 out of 10, teacher's great, hi Wade. But for our paper, we also were given a lot of freedom and it was a very broad topic. All we really had to do was pick an image of our choice and connect it to this broader and social cultural context. And I knew pretty much from day one, syllabus week, what I wanted to write about. See, I'm really into art. Drew that little guy up there. And it's kind of my number one passion. And I really just can't get enough of it. So, and really, what is art if not an image? So I figured I was going to do that. And I also love talking about myself. It's kind of why I'm here. So I figured I might as well combine my art with my topic. And I decided that I was going to use my most recent major art project, which happened to be a deck of tarot cards. So this is some examples of the tarot card images I did last year in IB Art. This was done with lots of time, lots of energy, and it was a series of painfully hand-painted cards, and they each had their unique symbolism and meaning that really only I, as the artist, understood. And that was kind of the purpose. It was for a grade, but more importantly, I did it for myself because I wanted to. And it has so much passion and so much love in it, and that's really what all art really is. It's about the artist's personal enjoyment, what they want to say. And we'll come back to both this topic and the cards later. So, oopsie. So for the thesis, what exactly did I choose to write about? I couldn't just write an entire chunk of text on the process and symbolism. And as much as I'd love to do that, it just wasn't really what the essay was asking for. I had to look at it on this broader scale. Yeah, I love tarot, but why does that matter? So I actually decided to take a defensive position. I argued the importance of modern day tarot, and that's kind of what my art is. It's a modern day interpretation on a already pre-existing traditional tarot, and it deviates from the original in many aspects. I wanted to write about how flexible tarot really is by just going into this history and connecting it to the contemporary tarot and how it builds off the traditions of the past. And in a way, it just enhances all the important aspects of it and resonates with this young modern audience of the 21st century. So to briefly summarize the long history, it really all started back in the mid-1400s or so. A bunch of rich noblemen in Italy commissioned artists to make a bunch of cards for a card game, and these became known as the Visconti Sforza tarot, and it really introduces all these figures that are still relevant today in tarot. So after that, a couple of years passed, France picked it up via cultural osmosis. They standardize it, they mass produce it, and it becomes known as the Tarot of Marseilles. And it's at this point that tarot gets their individual names. If you look at the images above, the Visconti Sforza tarot and the Tarot de Marseilles have many similar aspects in composition. The man is holding a stick, he appears to be going on some sort of journey, and it's at this point that the beggar-like figure in the Visconti transforms, rebrands itself into the fool in the Tarot of Marseilles, and he's going to also be very important later. And so, continuing on, up until this point, tarot is still mostly a game. It's all entertainment focused. And this changes in the 1700s or so, when a man named, Jean-Baptiste Alliette creates the esoteric and spiritual branch of tarot by making his own unique cards that was actually dedicated specifically for fortune telling. And most of you would know that tarot cards are for some sort of like fortune telling and like seeing the future stuff. Well, this is the guy who really started it. And well, after that, tarot goes through its last major transformation in the 1900s or so, when the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is arguably the most well-known deck, you've probably seen it before actually, it introduces the Fool's Journey for the first time, where instead of just being these figures on cards, they become characters with important stages in life to them that mirrors the stages of actual life in a way. And it features the fool as this protagonist of like a journey of self-discovery. And this resonated very strongly with the people of the time, and I'll explain why later. So, modern tarot. The shift from looking at historical tarot to modern tarot was pretty jarring in a way. I had to research history to get a feel for what's happening in the world and why they caused such changes in tarot history. Like for example, Rider-Smith's deck that adds this personal depth into tarot is arguably only as popular as it is because of this collective post-World War identity crisis and the counterculture hippie movement. So I had to take into account these like otherworldly factors that went into this paper, and it just went so much beyond than just I want to draw tarot. I'd have to imagine this artist's perspective. Why did they choose to do what they did? Did they choose to like adhere or challenge this traditional tarot imagery? And is one better than the other? I had to apply all these questions when looking at modern day tarot to observe this present shift in tarot that is still happening right now. Modern day tarot takes tarot and globalizes it so much. It produced so many unique decks, more than we've ever seen in the past. And this is all just attributed to the digital age, the internet, social media trends. And because of this, nearly anyone can make their own deck of tarot and produce it and just put a stamp on it and sell it for $20 at Barnes & Noble's. And this is an immense diversification of tarot in recent years. Every artist with oppressed backgrounds could illustrate whatever they want for an audience that they want to spread, So my favorite example of this is the modern day queer tarot made by Robert Barber and John Callahan. And this reimagines tarot through an LGBTQ positive lens. It dedicates this imagery to the community and offers them their history of the successes and progresses, and it features these key figures in the movement. I'm telling you, show this to one of the Italian noblemen in the 1600s, they would have a stroke. Okay, so just for comparison, this is the modern queer tarot and the Rider-Waite tarot. When you compare them side by side, you can see like lots of similarities in composition. There's like these parallels that mirror each other or sometimes even contrast each other. The star, which is shown above, center actually, represents hope, which Alliette in the 1700s attributed to. But the man in the queer tarot that represents it is actually this man known as Harvey Milk, who is California's first openly gay man to hold position in office. in a way, he represents hope to the community, which means the artist and author specifically believed he was the best representation of it. And this is something that primarily the audience, the target audience, would understand doing so. Because of this, it's clear that the artists are providing a social commentary as well as representing an oppressed audience and uplifts them by going against tradition to create their uniquely special tarot. Oopsie. Yep, okay, so back to my tarot. More images. I know, images quality suck. In my defense, I was not thinking about presenting this when I took pictures of it. When I illustrated my cards, I specifically chose tarot because I love the idea of wordless art as a method of storytelling. I want to feature my characters as heroic protagonists of their own story. And the art, while tedious, it let me explore the complexities of the human mind and experience in a way that made me appreciate tarot more than I ever could. You really just have to consider whether you want to stick to like traditional consistencies or challenge them, and you want to portray the card in this unique manner while also retaining the core components that make it the card. So my goal actually was to illustrate Korean mythos in a fantastical lens, and this is because I'm Korean American, but also because I'm an avid D&D player and I love making board building with my friends, and it's great. And it's my unique experience that led me to design my cards the way I did. The Fool, for example, is dressed in garb that is similar to a Korean entertainment troupe, which I specifically chose because it represented, in my opinion, elements of wandering while also a bit of whimsy, which modern tarot actually really likes to go into. And I just had to take all that research and just do it 21 times, and then you guys just have a tarot deck, no big deal. And I'm okay with this, because my art is flawed, and I won't be selling these, but the time and effort gives it the value, because I am my own audience. So doing my research, I learned that critics of modern day tarot believe it's kind of like inferior in a way to traditional tarot because it's commercialized and overproduced. It's saturated and shallow, and sometimes has like lost its symbolic depth over the years. And I don't really agree with this because I believe that tarot reflects the audience of its time. It shifts and changes over time to become what people want from it. It isn't a stretch today to claim that tarot, modern day tarot, is like unrecognizable from the tarot in the 1600s, but it's these consistencies that you see in nearly every iteration of it that makes its imagery so iconic. It's the fluidity and flexibility that makes tarot a dynamic tool for storytelling, and it makes it timeless and consistently influential as long as there are artists who are willing to make it. Some quick advice. Citations suck and it's time consuming, and you want to get them over with before you actually start the essay. And if you're going to procrastinate the essay, then you may need to make sure you're friendly with your UW teacher so they're likely to give you an extension. And if you're going to miss the extension anyway, don't do it twice like I did. Sorry, Wade. And some citations I did a little bit more than the advised amount, but otherwise I think it was a pretty reasonable amount, just because my essay was like significantly longer than I expected. And that's my thanks. That's it.
Thank you all for this really wonderful presentations. You all did such fantastic work. Can we hear for them? All right, so now as promised, we're going to open up the floor to questions. So feel free to ask our researchers questions as a panel or individually.
Sammy, I have a question for you.
Oh boy.
I'll
try my best.
Don't worry, this is a fun one.
Oh,
so
okay.
I've been, I study digital culture a lot. I've been looking a lot at AI and AI art specifically. Your presentation reminded me of, essentially, like I think early in your presentation you talked about the passion and love that these artists put into the tarot cards, and it struck me as exactly what I love about art, and someone putting their, personality and self and heart into their visual thing that they're making. Do you see, do you see tarot as a good representation of that kind of unique brilliance of art that, I don't know if AI always can get to, and we see a ton of AI slop everywhere.
So tarot itself is basically a bunch of individual art pieces that's in a deck. So there is a sense of like unity among them. They're like, you have to make a consistent tarot card deck unless you're actively trying not to. So I think that because each card has its unique symbolisms and like meaning to it, the artist has to put significantly more time and effort into designing each card, because it really has to adhere to the definition of it, while also representing what you want to represent. And don't forget, you have to keep the entire thing consistent. My art style significantly changed throughout the process because it took ages, an entire year in fact. And you can really tell when you look at the first one and the last one, just how much I've changed. And I think for me personally, it worked out in my favor because it showed my improvement. But if you're actually selling them, it's not probably that good. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the dumpling presentation. So I was quite surprised to find out that they were used for convenience. Like when they were first made, would you have ever thought that they were used for convenience? Like, did you ever think there was a different reason why they were made in the first place? Because I would have thought it was just like for fun or like for taste or something. I didn't really think about convenience, and it just makes so much sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I don't think I had initially even expected dumplings to come from any sort of reason, like what you said, just sort of why not? I mean, they taste good, but obviously there's a lot of things that taste good that you can make. I mean, I thought it was interesting because, like, the more I looked into it, that there was these papers talking about Eastern Europe and the role of food in Eastern Europe, Eastern European communities, and this one author who talked about sort of the story that a dumpling tells of almost showing like the perseverance of the people in that culture, talking about that creating a dumpling, that coming up with the dumpling allowed them to sort of feed themselves and keep themselves fed, especially during long journeys where it would be difficult to get a lot of food. Yeah, so I found it very interesting. It definitely wasn't something I had necessarily expected to see, but it was definitely very interesting to see that it did come from the sort of need to have a convenient food source.
Thank you. Do I see your hand?
Yeah, that's interesting. How can a historian avoid cultural bias when determining the origin of the dumpling which shows like the origin of many culture?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
So how is historian avoid cultural bias when determining the origin of the food that appear in multiple cultures?
That's a great question, asking about the biases that affect our ability to understand the origin. And so I kind of touched on it, but one thing that was very difficult, and it also makes me think about that article that talked about its importance in Eastern European communities, that you have this food that to everyone is very important, right? And so it becomes very difficult to be the one person. So like, I also looked at this Chinese paper about dumplings, and you can imagine being a Chinese researcher and discussing this thing that's important to your culture, and having to sit and acknowledge, well, this is very important to us, but maybe we didn't come up with it. Maybe it wasn't our original idea. Which you can imagine could be a little bit upsetting or frustrating to hear, to think, no, this is our culture, this is our food, how could you suggest that this isn't from us? And I think that becomes a big issue, where it's like everyone, you want to have this thing that's important to you, and you want to believe that it came from your country, and I think that's valid. And I think that adds complications. And another thing that adds complications with the bias in research is a lot of people really want to be included in the discussion about dumplings. And I've noticed this talking to people about my essay. Everyone always has something to say about, oh, well, what about this food that I grew up eating? I got that from friends. I got that from my own grandma. When she had read my paper, she said, well, this makes me think about chicken and dumplings, and dumpling soup. And eating that as a kid, and I was thinking, well, I don't know if I really counted that in my definition. And so it becomes this sort of problem too of everyone wants to be included. So you see on Wikipedia all these different foods that I wouldn't argue are really dumplings, but come from these individual contributors who it relates to them, and it personally affects them a lot. It's dumplings to them, and so they want to have it included. One last thing I'll mention was a guy on Wikipedia who talked about on the talk page. He said, "You're including all this random stuff that I don't think should count. All this stuff from all these random cultures that aren't dumplings. When you haven't even brought up the British dumpling, which is that one's a dumpling.
British dumplings?
Yes, there's apparently some British variation of the dumpling, And this guy, who explicitly mentions that he is British, argues that his dumpling has to be included, and that the definition is completely wrong unless his food is considered. And so I think that becomes a very valid problem, that it's hard to talk about these culturally important things from an unbiased perspective.
That is not a dumpling.
Yeah.
You might want to address the Roman perspective. I mean, in a way, they are the greatest absorbers of culture. Going to writers talk about Ovid's Metamorphoses, that text, of course, written by a Roman and absorbs Greek mythology and shared it with the world, and then gets translated to Shakespeare. And it's always, for me, it's always coming back to the Romans. But the Romans, I don't want to say they invented dumplings, right? But the writer in the 1st century AD, Apicius, wrote a book of a cookbook of the time, not that I made any of these foods, right? But he mentioned something called the globules and globs. So they made something like a dumpling. Now, the Romans are great in the sense that we absorb cultures, conquered cultures, terrible, horrific, all that. But they, from the way of there being that melting pot of Western civilization, interesting to see how they got connected as well. And the Brits, I mean,
Yeah.
they're so far north, and do they even know how to cook? Okay, so.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting thing just to mention, and it's like, well, did the Greeks come up with it, or did they take it from someone else, and then who did they take it from, and how are we supposed to unpack that? That was a lot of my project.
Strike card again?
I have a question for all three of you. Was there any particular part of your presentation or like your research that stuck out to you that was like your favorite tarot card, your favorite dumpling, or your favorite like parallel between Greek mythology and sort of Shakespeare, like that really stood out to you while you were doing research?
I think the bulk of my project was really trying to connect Shakespeare to Ovid, and I love the Folger Library. I was on their website almost constantly during the project, and one day for the first time I thought, I'm just gonna search Metamorphosis and like see what comes up. And I got a hit for it, and I'm like, that's really weird. And that was the first time I learned that it was actually mentioned in Shakespeare's plays in Titus Andronicus, and that was so interesting to me. I had no idea that there was like direct connection to show that yes, he did interact with this text, he did know this text, and that was really interesting to me.
I think one thing that I found interesting, or just sort of exciting to me, was parallels I was drawing to the stuff that I had learned in psychology, that like in every study you really have to take a step back and understand not only do we know something, so like with psychology it's like sure we can identify that a lack of dopamine is associated with depression, but how do we know that, and what does it mean to know that, and how valid is the resources that are giving us that information? You have to really think very deeply about where you're getting your information and how you're interpreting it and how that affects your end result. And so that was really exciting for me, was seeing that sort of relation between how you'd research something psychologically and how you'd end up researching food anthropology, like in an anthropological lens.
When I was writing my essay, my brain was on fight or flight, as in get this essay finished, which I didn't. But because of that, I didn't really have as much time as I wanted to talk about my tarot, which was initially what I wanted to do. But I think it worked out in my favor because I learned a lot of new stuff, lots of stuff about history of tarot that was really confusing to read about. So overall, I think what stood out to me was that I didn't really get to talk as much about myself as I'd love to, but it's okay because I've learned stuff about other people, I guess. My ego took a bit of a hit that day.
I have a question for the Shakespeare Ovid individual. Do you believe that an understanding of Greek tragedies, myth, and Ovid's Metamorphosis is crucial to understanding Shakespeare's intentions behind writing the play?
I think that you could absolutely go into Shakespeare knowing nothing about Greek mythology, even though I do think to an extent all of us in our culture do absorb that. We see so much influence of it in American society even. But I read Hamlet in my senior year of high school. I had no idea there was going to be any connection between that and Ovid's works. But I do think it does educate it in a sense. When we look at media in our current modern lens, I immediately jumped to Percy Jackson. It's where a lot of people in America got their origins with learning about Greek mythology. We know the stories, and that's what makes it more interesting. In Elizabethan England, they would have known these myths. That was their Percy Jackson. So going into Shakespearean plays, when they go to the Renaissance stage, they would know these references.
I have a question for the Shakespeare one. You talked about how Shakespeare had a habit of like almost morphing classical myths into language and concepts he thought his audience could understand. What value in these myths do you think Shakespeare identified that caused him to believe they were worth embedding so much of in his work?
So in England at the time, there was the Renaissance humanism movement, which I do discuss a bit in my paper, which was basically just them focusing on the individual self and on human motivation. Metamorphosis is a book about human transformation. So it has some physical transformations. In the myth of Philomela, she does turn into a bird at the end of it. But it's also emotional and psychological as we go through like these trials that heroes are going through. So I do think that in an extent. And I forgot your questions. I got halfway through. Would you repeat that?
Oh, you're good. What value do you think he identified in the myth that he embedded in his work that I guess made him think it was worth spending the time to put them into like the concepts or the language that he thought his audience could understand?
So literacy rates were on the rise at that time in England, but not everyone was fully literate. By introducing a story that people would already know, that was their bedtime story, they knew those myths by heart pretty much. It was something relatable to his audience to teach them.
What about your reference of the Narcissus myth, right? Was really good for Hamlet. Looks into his reflection to be or not to be. He gets so stopped in his way, he can't focus, he can't do what he needs to do, he's moved to inaction. And Narcissus does the exact same thing. And we, even if we're not aware of it, we're not all reading Ovid's Metamorphoses in school, at least we might have Percy Jackson. We are aware of it in our language. Who here hasn't said someone's a narcissist, right? It comes exactly from that myth of a guy who looks at his own reflection and falls in love with it, right? And is moved to inaction. Okay, at the end, he becomes a flower, but, you know, it's a good story, right? We don't have to do it at the end of it. And that's why we have a Narcissus, a daffodil flower, because Ovid tells us that cute tale of spring flower emerging from it. But we all know who a narcissist is.
I have one as a librarian for the panel. If you guys could go back in time and talk to yourselves when you first started this endeavor, what advice would you give yourself, or caution?
The exact same advice that I gave. Word for word. The minute, if I were to go back in time right now, the minute I go back, emailing my professor, hey, can I get an extension? I know the semester just started. Can I get an extension?
I think, I'm trying to think, like, what key advice would I take away from a lot of this? But I think one thing that really helps, that I wish I had done, was being a little bit more organized with my citations. Because when I was first doing research, I was like, okay, we're just like laying the groundwork, just finding stuff. And so I just kind of like copy in a link and just kind of start writing random stuff. And I really wish that I had organized it neater, you know, put like a header and said, this is specifically where I'm sourcing this information from, and here's exactly what I'm getting out of it. Because then I sort of had to work backwards and find, you know, like, okay, this note came from this citation, and I didn't use this citation at all. And it would have been a lot better if I had been a little bit more proper with my citations, which I think is always sort of the struggle, is cleaning up those citations before starting.
Yeah.
I think the best advice that I could give both to my past self and to anyone who's doing it is to not be scared to get out of Foggy Bottom, to go out into DC. Some of the most incredible sources I found for my papers were at the Folger Shakespeare Library at the National Gallery of Art, but you have to leave Foggy Bottom to do that. You can't. Gelman is incredible, and I found so many sources there, but the librarians at like the Folger Shakespeare Library had so much expertise on my topic that I would have never considered if I hadn't left Foggy Bottom. So I wish I had done that sooner.
And were the librarians there scary or intimidating?
No, they are some of the nicest people I have ever met. One of my primary sources, I was just talking to one of the librarians, and she said, you should look at this book that came out in 2022. I went down to the open stacks. It was literally the exact topic of my project written out for me. It was incredible. And if I hadn't just had that conversation, I wouldn't have known.
That's so great, yeah. I really love going outside of what we have at GW and getting out there in the world and talking to librarians, because librarians are really friendly and we like to talk. Any questions?
Wait, off topic, can I ask one question to Dumpling guy?
Yeah, do it up.
Okay, what's your thoughts on Pop-Tarts and Pizza Pockets being dumplings?
I think there is an argument that could be made if you want to really stretch it, because once again you're seeing this sort of filling within a wrapper of dough, and it also kind of comes down to sometimes you have to look at these decisions and just think, well, that's ridiculous, and I'm not going to say that, you know. But for me, where I drew my line, which I was very narrow with mine, I was more narrow than I think most people would be, where I was looking at especially foods with that sort of like semicircle shape, and thinking about that like sort of practical, like I said, like it has to be practical and convenient, which I suppose a hot pocket would be too.
But I'm really hot on the inside, so like maybe not that practical.
Yeah, but I was narrowing it down to be also sort of a similar like shape and style of cooking. But there is a lot of, you can open it up a lot and poke a lot of holes into things if you really want to.
It's like a sandwich. It's like this debate that like hot dogs and sandwiches.
Yeah, which since I do linguistics, the thing I come down to is we're not calling it that to make our lives harder. We're calling it a sandwich to make our lives easier.
Well,
You
I'm
know?
calling it that to make your life harder.
Yeah, so then why should we do that? You know? There's no essence of sandwich, it's just convenience. You know, we're not like, oh, it has to be a sandwich if it's this way. It's like, no, if I offer you a sandwich, there's something you expect. That's why we use the word sandwich. You know?
You've taught me so much about sandwiches in like 5 minutes that I've learned in like 18 years.
It's my favorite thing. Sandwiches, I suppose.
Oh, I see.
No, language.
I have another question as a librarian. Okay, so Justin, I know you spoke about this a little bit, but as a librarian, the main advice we give to students when they're researching is don't expect, like, build in some time and make your topic flexible. I was wondering, how did you guys handle that? Did you hit like a roadblock where you're like, oh wait, I have to readjust, or how did that look for you?
Oh, you have no idea. I made the bad decision to write my essay first and then think of the thesis after, which made me go back and forth with my professor and with myself many times. Many emails were exchanged. It worked out because I think we settled on something I liked, but the in-between was rough. It was really rough, trying to figure out how to explain my tarot in a cultural context when I hadn't actually done anything with it besides just submit it for a grade.
Yeah, I had a point where I thought I just have to scrap the whole thing. I can't do it.
Me too.
Yeah, and it helped. Like I had mentioned, just talking to somebody else about it and realizing that I had stuff to say. I just had to change my initial research question a little bit. You know, and that's a perfectly okay thing to do, especially when you've just gotten started. You're not married to a specific thesis. Hopefully.
Well, okay, this was like a week before the deadline, so yeah,
well.
maybe I was. Anyways.
My paper before this was a very similar topic, and going into my final research project, I wasn't sure if I would have anything new to add to the discussion, so I was fishing for a different thing to talk about, and I was going to cover plagiarism and Shakespeare, how there isn't really a sense of plagiarism in early modern England, but I didn't go with that, so that definitely did slow me down for a bit, but I'm very glad I continued with this topic because I realized I definitely did have more to say about it.
So I have a question for the entire panel. So Justin, you mentioned very early on in your presentation that you perceived this unspoken rule for UW courses, that you should write something that you're proud of. This is something I teach UW courses and I believe wholeheartedly in. I'm curious for the entire panel, you've already sort of gestured toward this, but I'm curious, why are you proud of what you've written? And what specifically makes you proud or excited?
Don't look at me, guys.
Okay, I am less proud of what I've written, but that one was more like a very ambitious writing project because I like purposely chose to go longer than the initial word count. But I'm more proud of the art I made because I mean it's kind of the reason why I chose it for my topic because I just had so much I wanted to talk about the art. when we started writing, it was like not that long ago that I finished the art piece. It was like pretty fresh on my mind. You know, I wake up, look at my cards, like I can't believe I did this and on time. Because again, it took over a year because I dedicated, but given that this was senior year of high school, it's like I had other stuff to do. So it was like I spent about a month on each cardish, maybe 2 cards in a month, depending on the time. And some came harder, some came easier. Like some I knew exactly what I was going to do. Others I had to like spend hours on Pinterest. But in the end, I think it was that because of the time that I was so like proud of my art, and I was like, I need to show this to everyone, and I need to explain to everyone just how much I like them, which is how I ended up here.
For me, I think there's always just something so rewarding about just finishing a paper. Like I think back to just a few years ago, if you'd told me like, oh yeah, sure, you can get a 12-page paper done in a semester, it's fine. I think like, there's no way. So just like being able to do it is very rewarding, having something that's completed and done, and that I put time into. And it was also just really fun because I was glad how much I was able to sort of put my own personality into it. That was something I was really happy with, because I think, especially like in high school, there's very strict guidelines on what exactly you have to talk about and how, and so I really enjoyed being able to write a piece that was a research paper, but very self-guided.
As a self-proclaimed literature and history nerd, I really love seeing how stories change over time, like looking back at old Grimm's fairy tales and how they become Disney movies, looking at readaptations of media. So getting to look back in history and seeing that that was something that they were still doing, that Shakespeare was adapting stories that he knew, was something super interesting to me. And also I love any chance to talk about Greek mythology. I was introduced to it when I was very little because of the Percy Jackson series, but it's been something I've been super interested in since then, and I loved getting to talk about it.
Who's your favorite Percy Jackson character? This is important.
When I was a kid, it was Annabeth. As I grow up, it's probably Will.
Ooh, good choices, good choices.
I like the one who died. It does not narrate down.
You look at
Oh, the one who died.
Wait, there's several.
Exactly, that's the bit.
It's only because more of a spoiler as you keep naming characters.
Or that too.
Oh, it's true.
Do you guys have any questions for the audience?
So scale of 1 to 10, how much have you procrastinated on the paper? Okay, 8 is not that bad considering we were like in the basement together on like the last like 2 days going like, we're cooked. But no, the paper isn't that big of a deal. I mean like, it's a lot when you're in the middle of doing it, but once it's over you'll be like, that's not that bad. I could go like 4 more and then you won't.
Yeah, I'd love to know what everyone's doing. I don't know if we have like the time to go in, but I'm very interested in everyone's specific subject. I mean, well, let's see a temperature reading. How many people feel like they know what they're going to be writing about? Like feel certain about it, and how many people are like, nah, I'm still thinking, you know? I'm still coming up with ideas and
Yeah, that's
Okay. So it looks like we have time for one more question. Actually, I'll leave it up to you guys. Is there anything you would like to tell the audience that we haven't asked you?
I think the primary thing to go into university writing, knowing on that final paper, is that you know what you know from the class. You are well equipped to write that paper. You're just filling in the gaps with your research, and that your professor is one of the absolute greatest resources you have. Like, I could not have done it without Professor Pollack. She's incredible. And I really think you do need to rely on that, because you could write a paper. You've written papers before. If you've written a 1-page paper, you could write a 12-page paper. You just do it 11 more times. It really, I know it sounds like a lot, but if you put in the effort, the paper will reflect that.
yeah, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but I think what really, really helps, don't torture yourself over this assignment. If you can have it relate to things that you're already interested in and things that you already have a pretty good understanding of, do that. No one's forcing you to do an assignment that's the most confusing topic you could pick, right? If you pick something that's, it's really like, you know, if you have a job you love, you don't work a day in your life, if you pick an essay topic you're interested in, you're gonna have a much easier time. And so that's just always been my recommendation with big projects, is like, let yourself have fun. There's no rule against having fun.
I'd rather write a long, tedious essay about what I love rather than a short one on something I hate. But that being said, when I was going into the essay, I was really worried that if I spent too much time writing about this, I would hate tarot cards. And that was partly true, because at the end of my art tarot carding, I was like, I'm done with this deck, I don't want to look at it ever again. But now I look at it, I'm like, oh my god, my children. Same for this essay. Halfway through, I was like, but after I finished, it was like, it felt good, you know, it was nice. I couldn't have done it without my professor, he has received many emails from me. Many emails, some at like unholy hours, and he always replied to them, even when he was sick. So.
All right, it looks like we're pretty much at time. So thank you all for being a great audience, and thank you to our